Welcome, everybody. So 2015, the year of the goat, if you are Chinese. If you're born in the year of the goat, you're supposed to be calm, you're supposed to be creative, and you're supposed to be pessimistic. And I hope we'll be creative today. You choose how calm you want to be and whether you want to be optimistic or pessimistic. I'm wondering if we have a mobile mic that I could use so that I can go over here and point at things. Stories to watch 2015. Hard to believe it if you were on the red line this morning, but things really are heating up. The hottest 15 years ever recorded have all been since 1997. This is the 354th month in a row in which global temperatures have been above their 20th century average. So if you were born, if you're under 30, you've never lived in a month in which temperatures have been below the average for the 20th century. But whilst things are heating up, temperature-wise, certainly not in terms of commodity prices or energy prices. This week, for the first time since the economic crisis, the price of oil fell below $50 a barrel. Many people would think this would be one of our stories. We thought about, should we make the shift in energy prices part of the story? And we decided not to, not because it's not important, but because we really want to focus on longer-term issues. We regard this as relatively a short-term issue. So what I want to do today is talk about, by the way, this gives a wonderful opportunity for countries to abolish energy subsidies, by the way. This is a gift to policymakers who want to abolish subsidies. So, 6 stories I'll briefly go through. Thanks very much, Michael. First, a global deal on climate. 2015 is a historic year because by December, we need to have, and we believe we will have, a deal on climate. The question is, what kind of deal will it be? The past year has been a year of amazing momentum building, whether the 500,000 people who marched through the streets of New York, or whether the growing sort of acceptance of smart policies on climate. Even although Australia this past year abolished its price on carbon, still true that 38 countries, 24 regions, including some here in the United States, now actually do have a price on carbon. And another thing that's happened in the last year, which will continue this year, is a shift in the dialogue. This is President Calderon, who's on our board, but also is the chair of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, presenting the New Climate Economy Report to Ban Ki-moon. And basically what that said is, not only is economic growth consistent with strong action on climate change, but actually, if you want to have strong economic growth that's sustainable, you have to have aggressive action on climate change. And this has received a much greater sort of momentum than we anticipated when we launched it about a year ago. And this will continue this coming year. We're just embarking upon phase 2 of the New Climate Economy work. But the plain fact of the matter is we haven't peaked yet. Carbon emissions continue to grow. We're heading in the wrong direction. And whilst it took 250 years of modernization, of industry and agriculture to use the first half of the carbon budget that we're allowed to use, we will use the second half up in the next 30 years. And once you reach the carbon budget and you go beyond it, you are no longer going to be within the 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degree Fahrenheit limit, and we are already starting to head for temperatures that are much higher than that. The costs are, of course, extremely high. So what to look for in 2015? How ambitious will pledges be? As you know, under the UNFCCC, countries have an obligation to put their first offers on the table, supposedly by March, but many of them have said they won't have it done until the summer. And so the question will be, how ambitious will they be? Now, 3 big blocks already, which account for half of all the emissions, have already said what theirs are. That's the European Union, the United States, and China. And if you add up that half, it's actually quite encouraging, the pledges that have been made, but they still are not enough. That half is not doing enough of what it needs to do. And the question will be, what about the other half, the other 190 countries that still have to, well, about 170 countries that still have to make it clear what it is. So question number 1, how ambitious will things be? Second, is the United States really going to be able to lead as it's starting to in this space? Those of us that have been heavily involved in previous conferences of the parties know very well that for the last few years it's been difficult for the United States really to play the leadership role that actually many people in the administration would like. And that's changing. And those of us who were in Lima last month really rejoiced to see the kind of leadership the United States was able to offer. But whether that can continue will really depend upon whether or not the big sort of policy elephant this year, which is the rules on existing power plants, whether or not that will be ambitious. I won't go into this in a great deal of detail. Suffice it to say that we do a great deal of work on this under what we call existing authority that the executive power, part of government has. To what extent can they really get to where they want to get to within a reasonable cost? So too, NRDC does a great deal of work, and we just wanted to list here what the options really are. And essentially, we believe that one could be much more ambitious at very little cost, and that's what's going to be required if the United States is going to achieve its 26 to 28% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2025 over 2005 levels. This would be the business as usual. These are the numbers that EPA, which is doing a very good job, by the way, is currently thinking about with its projections. We believe it could be even more ambitious than that at very little cost, and we've done a great deal of work on that. It's worth mentioning the fact that in a wonderful democracy that we have here, there are more than 3 million comments that have now come in on these. So you just imagine how many people you have to hire just to read the comments. This is very, very serious stuff. So that's the second question. And the third sort of real big question is, what will the shape of the deal be? It won't be your old, grandfather's plain vanilla, textbook climate deal where you sort of say, this is how much carbon we can emit, this is how we're going to allocate it to countries and sort it out, and everyone is accountable. It's going to be much more interesting than that. So 4 questions. How ambitious will the country offers be? And the answer will be, they won't be ambitious enough, but they will certainly be heading in the right direction. That's why the second question is so important. Will there be a serious review mechanism that will have some kind of ratcheting mechanism so that every 5 years countries will come back and they will actually then have some incentive to ratchet up their level of ambition? Third, what's the role of finance? This is hugely important politically and actually fairly important substantively. And it was very encouraging. As you know, last month, $10 billion have now been allocated to the new Green Climate Fund. But there needs to be a lot more thinking on this subject. And finally, very, very important, given that the ambition won't be high enough first time round, very important that there be some what we call long-term anchor. Sometime after 2050, when there is an agreement now that that's the target we're heading for, probably sort of net zero carbon emissions. So these are the 4 things to look for, and all is still to play for. So if you like, story number 1, which is huge, is will the world rise to the climate challenge? Story number 2, staying with the multilateral story, is the Sustainable Development Goals. I think everybody here knows that 2015 is the year in which the world will gather to take stock of the Millennium Development Goals, which will end this year, and to agree upon a new set of goals. Some people would say, well, why does it matter? A bunch of bureaucrats in New York, agreeing to some goals they really don't have any obligations to really adhere to. Well, we have a rather different view, and that's based upon what's actually been achieved in the last 15 years. You remember the Millennium Development Goals, which come to an end now. There were 8 of them with lots of indicators. They tended to be very poverty-orientated, education, health. There was one sort of relatively half-hearted one on environment, but these are the ones that really were taken seriously. And were they successful or were they not? Well, actually, quite successful. Not 100% by any means, but certainly B+. And if you look about it, I mean, never before in history have we had the pace of poverty reduction that we've had, halving of world poverty. I mean, truly astonishing, actually. Never happened before. Never before have we had, almost infant mortality during the 1990 to 2015 period, which is when the goals were for, fell by almost half. I mean, really quite astonishing. Never happened before. I should say maternal mortality has fallen by half. And the interesting thing, I mean, I remember very well as a country director for the World Bank living out in Indonesia in about 2003, and a group of countries, ambassadors, coming to me and saying, you're supposed to be running the World Bank. You coordinate the donor community here. Did you know that maternal mortality is the most failing MDG and has gone nowhere for the last 3 decades? What are you and others going to be doing about it? I mean, and so that's sort of what the MDGs did. And whilst in 1992, maternal mortality had gone nowhere for the last 3 decades, since 1992, it's fallen by half. Amazing. So that sort of indicates what's the role of this kind of thing. It's creating a sense. And so too, look, we don't need to go through all of these, but primary education is really quite impressive, although only half of the goal has been reached. The goal was universal primary education, and in fact, we halved the number of children not in school. There were 18% of children who were not in primary school who should have been. There are now 9%. So, I mean, not perfect by any means. So, obviously, we still live in a world of tragic poverty, albeit much less than it was. So whether it's 1.2 billion in extreme poverty, 6.5 million children dying unnecessarily every year under the age of 5, still 58 million children of primary school level who are not in school today. So what's different, and by the way, as I mentioned before, probably the least successful of the Millennium Development Goals was the one on environment. The reason for that, it was not very specific. It wasn't clear who really had the responsibility for doing things, and that's a lesson moving forward. So where are we now? Well, back at the Rio +20 summit, do you remember in 2012, it was agreed we should have not Millennial Development Goals anymore, but Sustainable Development Goals. Since then, there was a high-level panel chaired by President Yudhoyono of Indonesia, Prime Minister Cameron, and President Johnson Sirleaf. It came out with a report, and there was an open working group, all good UN kind of stuff, an expert committee on finance, and then in December, a sort of synthesis report, quite an interesting one, issued by the Secretary General. Pretty good stuff, by the way. I mean, I think those of us, and we have a large team working on this, we're pleased broadly with where things stand. But there's still a lot to play for this year. What's different this time? Universality. We live in a very different world. The Millennium Development Goals were basically what should developing countries do. The Sustainable Development Goals are what every country should do. This is a very important symbol of a shift in global power. Much more comprehensive in scope, moving away from just education and health and that kind of thing, moving towards, for example, there's one on energy, one on cities, a recognition of the importance of growth and economics, and sustainability at the core. One of the failures of the MDGs from a sustainability standpoint was that sustainability was sitting in a goal all on its own, didn't have any kind of links to the others. That's going to be very different this time round, where sustainability is embedded in each of the goals. So in energy, for example, sustainability is central to the energy goal. And a new approach to finance. Look, I mean, it's a different world we live in terms of finance. The importance of foreign aid is dramatically less than it was, albeit still very important from a catalytic standpoint. But think of tax revenue. When the MDGs started, no, in the year 2000, 1.5 trillion was the amount of domestic revenue in developing countries. Now that's almost 10 trillion. So you see this sort of incredible increase. I mean, the role of the private sector, the role of domestic finance will be radically different. So this is a very, very important political as well as a substantive time. Done right, these goals will have a very important role. And just in the lead up to that, one of the stories to watch is in July in Addis Ababa, there in Ethiopia. There will be a very important conference on financing development. 13 years ago, some of you may remember the Monterey conference on financing. This is the follow-up to that. And again, it will look very, very different from the Monterey conference. And it will be all about innovation in financial instruments. It'll be about leverage of the private sector, and it will be about the role of developing country finance as well. So the question, will the world embrace a new approach to sustainable development? A very important issue to watch. Complex because, you know, the machinations of the United Nations are complex. Will leaders leave the General Assembly in September, go home to their countries with an idea of how these goals will affect the way they lead their countries? All right, story number 3. Again, this is actually quite an important political story. It's about changing the way in which business is done in the world. New coalitions for action. The old sort of government-to-government way of doing things is breaking down quite rapidly. And instead we're seeing, or in complement to that, we are seeing the emergence of really interesting coalitions between the private sector, the government sectors, and civil society. And these coalitions are clear in their targets, they're clear in their accountability mechanisms, and they actually focus on action. So the question is, will they deliver in the coming year? Let me just sort of mention some of them. Many of these were highlighted at the Summit on Climate Change in September in New York. And it was, for those of us who were there, quite frankly, even those of us who had been working very hard on many of these, we were surprised and delighted with the level of engagement and enthusiasm. Just a few of them. For example, the Tropical Forest Alliance, which the United States government has been very heavily involved in, but also we have Unilever here today, we've got Mars here today, companies like Nestle, huge action starting to be on this. Many companies for some time have said, we are going to source our commodities, palm oil, for example, from non-deforestation methods. But up till now, we haven't really had a very clear way of monitoring and measuring. We do have now through Global Forest Watch. This partnership is now being resourced, setting up a serious secretariat under the World Economic Forum. What will happen now is that there will be a much, much more aggressive, transparent monitoring of who is procuring what from where and what is the environmental sustainability quality of this. So will this really deliver moving forward? Week after next in Davos, this will be highlighted in a big way. Renewable energy for all. For the last 50 years, multilateral banks and governments have been trying to electrify the developing world with some success. But only recently has the private sector sat at the table together with the UN, together with the international community, together with civil society, chair the executive committee, chaired by Chad Holliday, who was head of DuPont, was chair Bank of America, now chair of Shell. 80 countries have signed up to this. Clear targets, embedding both. We're going to eliminate the 1.3 billion people who don't have electricity, so full electrification by 2030, doubling the rate of improvement in energy efficiency, doubling the amount of renewable energy. Very clear goals, and the question is, will, during 2015, this also start to develop? This past year, a compact of mayors was established, and cities, as you know, have been showing more leadership than many national governments. And they're saying, wait a minute, we understand that actually a low-carbon future is not only good for the planet, it's extremely good for our competitiveness, it's extremely good for our citizens. It's a better quality of life. So we are all going to get together. We're going to agree on a compact of mayors, and every single year we are going to measure in a transparent, consistent way, which is now announced. We actually designed the system for measuring greenhouse gases. Consistent measurement. We can have targets that are clear. Every single year we're going to announce them. We want to register with the United Nations FCCC. And we're going to share best practice, and we're going to demonstrate that low-carbon development works. I mean, really quite remarkable. And that's going to grow and grow. Maybe 500 cities, perhaps, by the end of this year. Now, I'm sounding enthusiastic about all of these, but these are stories to watch. I don't know whether they're going to deliver, but we need to work very hard because it's a new way of doing business. And in turn, these cities have said, our plans for low-carbon development have got to be more ambitious than our nation's plans. And this then feeds back into the multilateral negotiations. We hope this is Mayor Paez of Rio. This is the mayor of Houston, Texas, who is now, I think that's her, Annise Parker, who is chair of the C40. Houston says, count me in. We've now figured out that actually we're spending 14% of our city income on transportation, whilst Copenhagen only spends 4%. Why would we throw away 4 to 10%? Whilst in fact, we want to create a buzzy downtown area. Young people don't want to move there anymore. We want to change the way we do business. It's very exciting, actually. Here's another one, restoring landscapes. For 3 or 4 years now, there's been something called the Bonn Challenge, where countries have been saying, look, we really do believe in restoration. We understand there are 2 billion hectares in the world that actually are degraded land, not very productive. We do understand the economics and finance and sustainability, the benefits of sustain. We're going to make some commitment. But in New York in September, 350 million hectares out of the 2 billion were committed. And well, what does it mean to make a commitment? Well, some countries are now coming forward. This is 60 that have signed up to something called the Bonn Challenge. And then in Lima, we had a Latin American alliance, 8 countries committing 20 million hectares by 2020. So they called it the 20 by 20. And they said, look, we want to be transparent. We now know that this can be measured through Global Forest Watch and other remote sensing means. And potentially this could even feed into future carbon markets. Who knows? So we're starting to see a really remarkable sort of beginning of a real movement, which basically says, you know, we have this wonderful capital stock in our backyard, in our own countries. It's being wasted. It's degraded land. Why don't we use it for something that's good for the economy and good for the environment, and good for society, reduces poverty? Doing this right could lower the carbon gap by more than 20% and bring a couple $100 billion a year, mainly to poor people in rural areas. So this is a winning ticket, but it hasn't been happening. And so this is a very good example. Together with these 8 countries, there were a group of private financiers who brought $350 million as a sort of starter money to the table, saying, hey, if we can discuss with you good deals, count us in. We will help finance that. So this is a really very important initiative. In April this year, in Bonn, countries will be gathering to get more commitments from countries that aren't yet part of this, and also for those that are part to lay out much more detailed action plans. Price on Carbon Club, this is the last one. A slightly different notion of a club. I think many of you in this room know that in New York, 73 countries, governments, well over 1,000 companies now signed up to the idea that a carbon price is a good idea. The World Bank deserves a great deal of credit for sort of moving this initiative along. The question here would be, it's all very well, very nice, and very good progress, but what will happen in the coming year? Will these companies start actually using some of their lobbying muscle in this regard? Will these countries actually start moving towards something? Simply saying you intend to do something is nice, but quite frankly, it doesn't solve the problem. So there's a lot to be looked for here in the coming year. In particular, some of these member countries and companies, will they start putting real numbers on these? And so this needs to be really interrogated in the coming year, but potentially terribly important in the lead up to Paris. So the question is, will these coalitions start to deliver, these unusual coalitions, which are actually a new way of doing business, and will they actually then create a greater sense of ambition for the multilateral processes, whether the deal of climate in Paris or the SDGs in September? So that's story number 3. We're halfway through, so and we'll accelerate now. So if you need another cup of coffee, go and get one. Story 4, water. Water is always an important story, but there seems to be something going on out there right now. And 2015 is something when we may see a bit of a tipping point with regard to private sector, public sector, and citizen behavior with regard to water. Look, everybody knows the sort of the tragedy of the 1.2 billion living in deep water scarcity areas with massive social and gender implications. We have a tool called Aqueduct. Some of you are familiar with it. It basically looks at the 15,000 major watersheds in the world, does various modeling things. It actually was created at the request of the private sector, actually. Goldman Sachs and General Electric and others came to us and said, look, we're really starting to get concerned about water risk. And the reason to get concerned is pretty obvious. Everyone in this room is familiar with the California, 1,200 years. The drought going on now in California is the worst in 1,200 years. Remember, the Central Valley here produces nearly half of all the fruit and vegetables in the United States. Very serious stuff. But of course, California is just one part of the world. I think you've probably heard of Sao Paulo, where reservoirs there are now down to between 5 and 7% of the water they should have in at the moment. Very, very serious. Sao Paulo produces, I think, 1/3 of, or almost 1/3 of, 30% of Brazil's gross domestic product, 20 million people here. The interesting thing, though, about Brazil is that we talk a lot about Sao Paulo just because it's in trouble right now, but Brazil actually illustrates a very important point. Brazil has more fresh water than any country on the planet. But the people aren't where the water is. And so the Amazon basin has half of all the water. And Brazil has, I think, 13% of all the fresh water in the world, which is remarkable. Half of all the water, but only 4% of the people. The people all live here, where actually there are very, very serious problems. And we're seeing actually it's a very important historic thing. What happened is when we started to get good at engineering, we started living where engineering could solve the problem, where we could pump water out of the ground. But now we're going sort of beyond where engineering can take us. And so you're going to start seeing some pretty interesting things here. So too China, again, talking about East Coast people living there, 90% of coastal cities face water stress in China. Not 1,200 years, but 60 years, and quite serious. Now, what are we looking for? Well, for example, the private sector now is getting much. I mean, there are companies in this room that are taking water risk much more seriously. I don't think McDonald's is here today, but McDonald's, through its entire supply chain, now uses the water risk indicators to make sure that actually it's not exposing itself to too much risk. Ambev, the great beer company, has managed to reduce by almost 40% the amount of water it uses. Procter & Gamble now does serious analysis through its entire supply chain. I bet Unilever does too, and I bet that Mars does too. Companies here starting to take things much more seriously. And this year, very interestingly, Bloomberg, with whom we have a very good relationship, they came to us and said, look, this now has become an economic and risk issue to so many companies. We want to put all your data on our terminals. So 320,000 terminals now have water risk data for these 15,000 aquifers. So there's something that's happening out there. And when the private sector starts taking this seriously, governments will start taking it seriously. And we're already starting to see the emergence of treating water the way it ought to be treated, which is a very precious and scarce resource. We're seeing new water laws, Governor Jerry Brown, remarkable what California is doing now, all kinds of issues of water pricing and so on around. So this is something to look for. We think we might be close to a tipping point. And of course, infrastructure is one way of doing it. In China, a few months ago, they opened the first stage of the biggest water diversion project in the history of the world. It'll take 50 years to build entirely. $62 billion, basically bringing water up from the Yellow and then the Yangtze rivers to the north. And this is one approach. If you've got $62 billion, but a lot of places in the world don't have that kind of money. And so what you're also going to be seeing is a lot of what we call natural infrastructure. In this country, we're starting to see that really take off in a big way. A lot of other countries now are coming to organizations like ours and TNC and others and saying, could you help us think through the idea of natural infrastructure, restoring nature's ability to provide water through watershed management, afforestation, and so on. So just to sort of something to watch in terms of what we're going to be producing, we're going to be issuing in the next couple of months projections of water risk. So we will take what currently is a static modeling environment for the 15,000 aquifers, and we're going to use IPCC scenarios and population growth and economic growth projections to show how things will change in those 15,000 aquifers. So this is actually going to be quite important, and this in turn, we believe, will have an impact on how around the world governments, private sector, and citizens are going to take things seriously. So will water risk rise to the top of the global agenda? I think those of you that know about the World Economic Forum annual survey of risks know that water has for the last 2 or 3 years been very, very close in the top 4. Okay, story number 5. We couldn't possibly do this year without having a story about the country that is perhaps going through the biggest discontinuity of all in terms of policy, which is India. We have a prime minister who not only is the first BJP prime minister for 10 years, but he's got pretty strong views about what his mandate is, and he has a very, very strong mandate. And his starting point is that India is not delivering economic growth and jobs the way that it ought to be. There was a time sort of in the first part of the decade when the belief was India can do what China has done and what East Asia has done in terms of growth. But more recently, you know, the view has gained currency that actually, no, we aren't there, and we need something sort of pretty radically different in terms of a deregulated, red tape cutting kind of policy. And so the coming year is going to be exceedingly exciting for India. It's got massive opportunities, but also huge challenges. In the next 20 years, 200 million, more than 200 million people will move to the cities of India. So India has traditionally been not very urbanized. By 2030, 600 million people will be living in the cities of India, up from about 360 million today. Some people think that East Asia and China has the worst pollution in the world. Actually, it doesn't. India has half of the worst 20 polluted cities in the world, and Delhi is right at the top. In other countries, air pollution is the issue that citizens get very agitated about. And so the question will be, in this very lively democracy, the new government, will this prompt a really new approach to urbanization? So too, the energy shortfall in India. India, massive world power emerging, and yet its electricity production is certainly not where it needs to be. 300 million still lack access to electricity. So the new government has come in with very, very strong imaginative ideas. One is on urbanization, 100 smart cities. Very clever approach was to say, we are going to have 100 smart cities. And then people have to figure out, what does that mean? And that actually has led to a very productive debate. What is a smart city? It's not just a bunch of, Ethernet cables. It's actually about doing things differently. It's about thinking about city from the citizen standpoint and the private sector investor standpoint. So, for example, there's an emerging movement in India to start saying, wait a minute, we actually want to reclaim our cities, something the World Resource Institute has been very involved in the last year. Now almost a dozen cities, including Delhi, have once every month. They have a Sunday that's devoted to people, not to cars. And this is part of being a smart city. So we're going to see some very, very exciting things, we believe, with regard to the cities in India. Let's remember also that, that 75% of all of the urban infrastructure in India in 2050 hasn't been built yet. So this is a wonderful opportunity. Sometimes we tend to think, oh, well, it's too late, you know. It's not. We're working in cities like Ahmedabad, and the choices there of how they grow are huge. I'm delighted that Annie Dasgupta has just joined us as our director of the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, because this for us is huge. We have about 200 people now working on this issue. So what is a smart, low-carbon city? Okay. And then on renewables, again, consistent with the ambition of the new government of India, they've said, yeah, the old government had some great plans of 20 gigawatts of solar energy, which was good, because it's only now, I think, about 3 gigawatts. So there was this huge ambition from the last government. The Modi government said, no, let's quintuple that. So going up to 100 gigawatts of solar power by 2022. This is a massive commitment. That's a 30-fold increase. So, but that's the level of ambition. If this were to be delivered, it would be a total game changer. So it's definitely, and together with that, a light bulb in every home was a commitment that the new government made, which again would be transformative in terms of those sustainable development goals that we were talking about earlier with regard to poverty, with regard to literacy, with regard to population growth, and so on. So the question for India is, given its massive new ambition, will it deliver on these fabulous things like renewable energy, smart cities, and so on? Also, will it develop the right kind of balanced growth? One can accelerate growth very quickly and get into all the traps that many other countries have got into. Or, as the new climate economy says, you actually can accelerate growth quickly, but heading towards a sort of low-carbon, resilient future. So this is a huge issue, and there'll be lots of sort of tea leaves that are to be read in 2015. And of course, some pretty important conversations internationally, as India now, for really the first time, is saying, wait a minute, I mean, this isn't a bilateral world, US and China. We're as important. And so you've got this extra dimension as we head towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate deal, of this massive ambition at home, and this great sort of opportunity to play the role of global leader and citizen. So will India successfully embrace high efficiency and low carbon growth? And finally, just a little trailer here, new leadership. I mean, clearly, around the world, we have a number of leaders. We've talked about Modi, President Dilma. Often when presidents or prime ministers get second terms, they raise their level of ambition. Sometimes they lower their level of ambition. What is President Dilma going to do? What's she going to do on the water policy, for example? What about the restoration agenda? What about the forest agenda? And so on. In Turkey, quite ambitious goals with regard to sustainable development and renewable energy and climate change. And this is sort of the big uncertainty. President Yudhoyono, who was there for 10 years, great ambition on forests and a number of issues, but didn't deliver actually, not necessarily his own fault, but didn't deliver quite as much as many people had hoped on the sustainability side, even though he certainly did in terms of modernization of the country. A brand new, very, very different president. How is he going to lead? And then obviously, since we're in Washington, the US has massive stories to watch in the coming year, starting this week. Several colleagues here, Kevin and Christina, might want to come for the question time, but there really are some pretty interesting issues, ranging from, to what extent does existing authority enable things to happen, to very important issues of at what stage will the citizens of the United States really insist that we all our politicians understand the importance of climate change, and we really grapple with this issue. I mean, we no longer can deny it exists, and actually with the growing analysis that's coming out, we've got to pretty soon face up to the fact that we really need to do something about it. What role will Congress play, and to what extent will President Obama continue to do what he clearly seems to be doing at the moment, which is saying, actually, I do want a legacy in this area. And then finally, in terms of looking forward to the next presidential debate, interesting question of at what stage might the idea of putting a price on carbon be injected into politics at the highest kind of level? We don't know. Most people would say, oh, it could never happen here. But actually, the history suggests that things happen much quicker and much more unexpectedly than many people predict. Things often take a long time to get going. When they get going, my goodness me, it happens very rapidly. Just look at issues like gay marriage and so on. So really interesting things. By the end of this year, who knows what we might see. So those are the sort of 6 stories that we focus on, and we try to pick stories that are sort of long-term in their implication, potential game changers, a global deal on climate, sustainable development goals, new coalitions for action. Will they deliver? Water risk rising, India in the spotlight, and new leadership in 2015. Oh, I guess that was the last one. I thought we had some beautiful picture to end. But let me just say, I mean, 2015 is an important year for many, many things. I mean, human rights, for example, will be on the agenda this year because 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery, and the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta. And you may have heard recently of an elderly American couple who were visiting the site of the Magna Carta. And they asked, when did King John sign the Magna Carta? And they were told, well, it was 1215. And the husband said to the wife, oh, honey, we missed it by just 20 minutes. So don't miss these stories in 2015. Thank you very much.